The breath tasted of pine and something older, iron and moss, and Jack felt, with the blunt clarity of someone who had stared at a place until the place stared back, the exact moment the world had decided he would not leave it the same. He stood in a clearing ringed by trunks like cathedral columns, camera hanging useless at his chest, pants stiff with dried sap, and in his palm a print that was not myth. 5D. The breath tasted of pine and something older, iron and moss, and Jack felt, with the blunt clarity of someone who had stared at a place until the place stared back, the exact moment the world had decided he would not leave it the same. He stood in a clearing ringed by trunks like cathedral columns, camera hanging useless at his chest, pants stiff with dried sap, and in his palm a print that was not myth. 5 deep, elongated impressions in sodden earth that dwarfed his boot. He pressed the pad of his thumb to the nearest hollow as if proof could be transferred by touch, and the forest answered with a sound low and liquid, a sigh that moved through the needles like a name. His heart flinched, not from fear exactly, but from recognition, like gazing at a thing he'd loved and been ashamed to abandon. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They had told him the woods would take him if he let them. His brother had been only 26 when he had gone into the pines with a grin and a folding map and a promise to be back for coffee. 3 months later, the map was scorched in a drawer, and the coffee had gone cold in a cup with a ring of dust at the bottom. Jack had counted everything in the ledger of his life since then. The inch-long print of a shoe that diverted into nowhere, the witness who swore she'd seen hulking shoulders moving through fog, the cold nights spent listening to his mother tell himself she had simply walked under a wrong sky. Proof, Jack decided, would be enough to stitch him back together. Proof that his brother had touched a thing as old as the ground. Proof that the world had not simply swallowed him into nothingness. He had taken a week, 7 days of rain that made the river a bright running seam, 7 nights of sleeping like an animal with one ear raised, 7 mornings where he would find footprints widening, leading, pausing like commas in a sentence he could not yet read. He lived on canned beans and the stubborn, brittle hope you can nearly taste when your throat is bone dry. He would catch himself humming the songs his brother used to whistle, tuneless, practical hummings that made the pines answer with echoes that were almost words. On the 7th day, under a low, crackling sky, he had followed a scent of earth and something green, and found the clearing, and the prints, and a patch of moss that was pressed down like a pillow someone had knelt on. When he returned to the ranger station, hands filthy enough to be photographed, hair braided with pine needles, there were more men than there had been when he left.
Uniforms that smelled of bureaucracy lined the chipped counter. A 3-wheeled truck with an emblem he didn't recognize idled outside, and the badge he was handed had the hairline seriousness of everything he feared. Agent Nolan Thorne moved through the room as though the map of the country ran over him like rail tracks, efficient, leveled, a man who could fold a continent into a margin note. Nolan's jaw was the precise shape of someone who never let sorrow linger in his face, an angle cut for sentences and reports and quick conclusions. He spoke best when he spoke little, which is how authority learned to sound like mercy. "Mr. Mercer," Nolan said, with the kind of polite attention that is the precursor to interrogation, "you were out there 7 days." "Yes." Jack felt his voice like flint. It came in short, certain pieces. "I found prints. I have photos." He put the camera on the counter like an offering, pictures sliding out like pages. Nolan's eyes scanned them without any raw astonishment, only calculation. Somewhere behind that steady gaze was an arithmetic that counted risk and consequence, and the slim edge between public fear and containment. Elena stood apart, leaning against a sagging bulletin board where local notices curled at the corners, and someone had stapled a faded recipe for sourdough. She had the look of someone in possession of a private history you couldn't find in any official file. Dark hair braided down her back, calloused thumbs, a family name people in town said like a blessing and a warning. Her forebears had come from places where the forest was a relative, Omul Paduri and Puschin were not superstition in her grandmother's kitchen so much as living relatives who taught children to listen to stepping stones and the hum under roots. Elena's eyes were the color of late moss. They caught Jack's face in their steadiness, and for the first time that day, he felt something unspooling in him that wasn't only the old cyclical ache. "You didn't tell them you were coming," she said, not quite a question. Her voice had a shape to it that suggested she could tell if his story had holes in it from the way he breathed. He told her the short version, his brother's name, the year, the empty coffee cup. She listened with those moss-colored eyes, and when she finally spoke, she said simply, "You shouldn't have stayed that long." He could have thought she meant the forest. She meant other things too, the way a man's head could be filled with the desire to prove he was not a fool or a coward or a son with an unanswered ledger. "My brother," Jack said. The name tasted like a stone. He had come to find him, or the thing that had taken him, and he would not leave until the ledger had a page. Nolan watched Mr. Mercer and Elena Moraru exchange the kind of half-trusted glance that promises alliances might form if necessity demanded it. He nodded now to a subordinate, and a thin folder was handed to him, the kind of classified file that smelled of government offices and fluorescent lights. Inside were scanned pages, notes, old photographs with corners cut crooked, a diagram showing a grove ringed with protected markers. He nodded now to a subordinate, and a thin folder was handed to him, the kind of classified file that smelled of government offices and fluorescent lights. Inside were scanned pages, notes, old photographs with corners cut crooked, a diagram showing a grove ringed with protected markers. "We already have interest in this area," Nolan said, as if the words were an apology. "There's been activity here for decades. Wildlife research teams, containment proposals." "You mean you knew?" Jack's voice broke the theater of Nolan's composure into something brittle. "You knew there were footprints worth tracking, and you didn't tell the family?" Nolan set the pictures down with the patient, terrible steadiness of someone who knew the weight of choosing truths carefully. "We have to manage what the public sees." The words were not meant to soothe. When people do not understand something, they create monsters. Panic is not a responsible tool. Elena's face went a quiet, sharp thing. "Our people don't call them monsters." She used the plural, the ancestral we, as if reminding Nolan that heritage could not be filed away. "My grandmother used to say they keep the balance. They are not for taking apart and keeping in cages." "You don't get to dictate how the country protects itself," Nolan replied. His tone was an instruction as much as a threat, and for a moment Jack saw the line of steel that made the man. Protection, he had decided, meant control. Elena's people had always spoken in temperate, rooted ways. Nolan spoke in the quick verbs of power. The sheriff arrived then, fat and apologetic, hands like soft bread. He had a radio buzz that said protocol, and a way of asking that had already conceded the answers. "We have orders," he murmured, creasing his face like lined paper. "Federal directive. For your safety, Mr. Mercer, we need you to hand over the media you collected." His gentleness was a trap. Jack thought of the print in his hand, of the low sound in the clearing, of a sensation that had not felt like violence, but like kinship. He thought of the ledger pages he had promised to fill. He fumbled for the camera and the notebook he had kept, fingers sticky with old sap, and handed them over like a man surrendering a child. Outside, the sky had the uncomfortable clarity of a bruise about to bloom. The woods around the station hummed, pines keeping their counsel, a wind that smelled of rain and something older than government. Jack felt the press of it against his scalp, and then there was Nolan's angle of a smile, all efficiency and plate glass. "You did well getting a clear shot," Nolan said, as if Jack were a reporter and not a son trying to name a missing brother. "There are things we can do. We can analyze, catalog." "You lock them up," Elena said. "You will put them in cages and call it research." "We will protect the public," Nolan replied. Her mouth thinned.
"You mean you'll protect the public from ever knowing they're human in some way? Intelligent, sentient?" A tremor passed through Jack, the kind that runs under bones when a lid slides off a pot and steam rises. He had not thought of the creatures as people at first. Fear and habit had carved them into the monstrous. But the tilt of Elena's voice, the way her hand cupped a photograph of children, old pictures of her grandmother with a coal-smeared face, a myth held tenderly, and that soft, stubborn injunction, "They keep the balance." It reframed everything. The prints he'd followed were not the marks of beasts, but of beings, making a path through the world, possibly watching, possibly mourning, possibly teaching. "You're staying in town then?" Nolan asked, more a plan than a question. "I have to talk to the family," Jack said, and his words were a bridge built out of obligation rather than resignation. The dilemma clicked into place with a hard certainty.
stay and push against federal containment, possibly lose the chance to find his brother, walk away and keep his family safe, but his ledger empty. He could feel the forest at his back like an ancestor's hand, warm and patient, asking him to listen. Elena's jaw softened when she saw the way Jack's hands curled, the way he kept losing and finding his breath. "My grandmother used to say," she murmured, "that the forest does not want us to prove it by killing what we cannot name. It wants us to learn how to keep what must remain." There was a sorrow in her voice that made Jack think of quilts and anonymous graves and the small domestic rituals families build to cover the world when it is raw. Nolan cleared his throat, the sound of someone pulling the pin on a plan he had made many times in his head. "We will need to secure the perimeter. For your safety, we will restrict access to the forest for a time. Any unauthorized entries will be treated as interfering with a federal operation." The last words were a sealed envelope of threat. Interference equals consequence. Jack looked from his brother's unread smiles in a photograph to the widening line of trees visible through the station window. The print he'd felt with his thumb vibrated in his memory like a chord. He had come to the woods to see. Now the woods were threatened with being seen by people whose first answer was containment. He felt suddenly raw with something that was more than grief, a combustion of anger and fear and an urgent, secret tenderness for the thing that had died his brother, or had let his brother live in its shadow. He could hand over the evidence and accept Nolan's promise of analysis that might mean file drawers and herbariums and dead things pinned under glass. Or he could refuse and be a troublemaker, a man who stirred the hornets enough for them to sting the institution that would not hear. He heard his mother's voice, thin with years. "Don't make it worse."
He heard his brother's whistle, bright and thoughtless, drifting from a past that could not be made new. Between the station and the forest there lay a choice that would determine what kind of man Jack would be. The agency saw proof as a commodity to be controlled. Elena saw the forest as kin, deserving. He heard his brother's whistle, bright and thoughtless, drifting from a past that could not be made new. Between the station and the forest there lay a choice that would determine what kind of man Jack would be. The agency saw proof as a commodity to be controlled. Elena saw the forest as kin, deserving of rights. Jack stood at the threshold like a hinge, and in the distance, beyond the truck and the folding map flattened on the counter, the pines kept their secret vigil. The dilemma tightened into a kind of holy pressure. Press on and risk everything for truth, or retreat and carry the truth like a warm coal you cannot turn the heat down on. As the rain began again in the tin roof's thin tattoo, Jack folded his hands around the camera like a talisman. He felt the ledger of his life, the years mapped in blank paper and missing coffee rings, and knew that he had to make a choice that would not be simple and would not be safe. He glanced at Elena, the small cluster of decisions gathering around her shoulders, and then at Nolan, whose control was a ready hand on a lock. Somewhere under the debate and the orders and the careful bureaucratic languages, the forest breathed. It waited. It had been waiting longer than any government directive could pretend to reckon with. When he finally spoke, it was not the dogged demand for proof that had brought him this far. "If you take them," he said, meaning the prints, the tracks, the creatures themselves, "you take the chance to learn, not just to own a specimen and call it solved." He surprised himself by the heat under the words. "You take the chance to make them what we fear." Nolan's jaw moved. His hand rested on the folder's edge like a promise of authority. "Mr. Mercer," he said, quietly, "we both know the world does not afford the luxury of trust when the stakes are so high." The choice clicked in Jack's chest like a gear. The first act of this story closed not with violence, but with a quiet, terrible alignment. Men and systems ready to keep control. A woman who kept songs at her mother's knee, and a man in the middle, with a ledger open and a print in his palm. The forest waited beyond the brittle glass of the station, patient as an old god. Jack's dilemma hanged between them, a thread so thin it risked snapping, and yet taut enough to pull everything into motion. They put him in a motel room that smelled faintly of mildew and lemon cleaner, the kind of place where time lay on the sheets like a thin dust. Nolan's men took his boots for prints, cataloged his camera like an object of forensic worship, and left him with a thin paper cup of coffee that tasted like apology. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, her braid uncoiling down her back, and for a while they only breathed in the same room, two people who had shared a clearing and a sound,
and did not yet know how to shape those things into sentences. "You shouldn't have given it up," she said finally, one shoulder turned toward the cheap mirror.
There was blame in it, soft enough to be careful, sharp enough to be honest. Not to them. Jack laughed, an animal, short thing, and then his face folded into the way it had when he had lost something small and ordinary. "What would you have had me do?" He kept thinking of the sheriff's hands, smooth with reluctance. They could have taken the prints and made it disappear anyway. I thought, if the feds had access, maybe they'd have answers. "You thought they'd have answers," Elena corrected, a gentle mirror. "They have files. Files smell like endings." He thumbed the scar under his wrist, the one he had gotten falling off a roof as a kid, when the world simply didn't bend to his shape, and felt the same old argument unfurl. Evidence is proof. Proof will put an end to the ache. But proof could be a weapon. Proof could be a way of sealing things into drawers where no one could hear them breathe. Outside, there was the dull thrum of activity, trucks and radios, and men who moved like they were performing in necessary violence. Jack watched Nolan move through his team through the motel's slanted window and saw how the agent made the distance between humanity and machinery look tidy. He also saw Nolan by the truck, alone for a moment, staring at the tree line as if he were trying to memorize it into a graph. The sight soothed and irked him at once. Nolan was dangerous not because he burned bridges, but because he built walls. "He's going to try containment," Elena said. "They're always going to try containment. They will put up fences. They will claim it's for safety, and then they'll make it an experiment table." Jack turned to her, the motion sudden. "Then we'll stop him." She met his eyes, and the forest in her gaze grew larger. "How?" The question sat like a stone between them, too raw for simple answers. He thought of his brother's laugh, of the way the man had once left a notebook open with a pressed fern inside it, as if the natural world had been something one could fold and store. He thought about the ledger he had kept, the list of meetings with officials and dead ends, the way hope had become habit. "We find proof that can't be cataloged," he said. "We find something they can't justify taking." His voice trembled with a mix of desperation and a nascent, stubborn courage. "If we can show the town what they are, if we can show that the forest is watching, and that these things aren't threats, maybe we can make a shield." Elena's laugh was small. "Shields have holes," she said. "We have to be careful with where we place them." Over the next days, they became a cautious kind of conspiracy. Nolan tightened patrols. The federal flag hung like an accusation at the ranger station. Jack's camera was returned with files copied, angles noted, time-stamped. The prints they'd photographed were cataloged under a neat code, U09BF199, and placed into a bureaucracy that treated each anomaly like a project. The town shifted around them. The diner where old men argued over engine oil, the church where candles smelled of wax and prayer, the market where Jane, the baker, whispered about sightings with the parishioners. Rumor, like a root, threaded itself below sidewalks. Some people were afraid. Some were eager to be part of something spectacular. Some wanted nothing more than their small lives untroubled. Jack found himself pulling toward Elena's family's house on the edge of town, as if the place had gravity. The Mararu kitchen smelt of broth and charcoal, and something sweet cooling in the window. Her grandmother, Anna, moved like the slow moon, unhurried, unbothered by the modern's ramble. She had a face like carved wood and hands that could unspool a spool of trouble into a soft yarn. When Jack met her, she looked at him as if assessing a new knot in the lineage of grief, and then, quietly, she offered him soup. "You have the city's smell still," she said in a voice that had the cadence of a story told by a hearth. "Your brothers smelled of smoke and river." There was no judgment in it, just recognition. He wanted to tell her everything, raw and unedited, the prints, the sounds, the way the forest had answered his thumb, but she listened the way someone listens to rain, patient, and certain the water will find its place. "You must learn their language," she told him when he finally forced the words out, "or at least listen to it. Not all of us go into the woods to name things. We go to be part of the balance." She set a small wooden talisman on the table between them, a carved figure with eyes like half moons. "This is for traveling," she added, "not for protection from men, for listening."
Jack took it like a bargaining stone. It was heavier than it looked. It felt like responsibility. "How do I listen?" he asked, which was the question that had rotted the edges of all his previous plans. Anna's smile had the faint pity of someone who knows the stubborn ways of men. "You stop wanting to prove. You stop asking and begin hearing." She poured him more broth. The sound of the ladle was a small, significant drumbeat. But wanting to prove was not an easy habit to unlearn. Jack was not a man built of patient silences. He had been raised on the noise of lists, the clatter of tasks that turned into meaning. He found himself restless in Anna's calm, itching to do something, anything that felt like movement. He wanted evidence that could not be corralled into a file. Elena watched him from the doorway, arms folded. Worry knotted in the line of her mouth. She saw how he listened to the town, to the patterns of the men who had not been born to these woods. She saw how he flinched at the idea of containment, how anger lit his face like a flare. She saw, too, an aching tenderness when he spoke of his brother, a softness that seemed to make him more dangerous, because it was real.
"We could set a camera where you found the prints," she suggested one night, voice a whisper as if the house itself had ears, but not to hand to them, to watch, to gather slowly. The plan was small and precise. "And we could talk to the families who have lost people. There's a woman in Dry Creek, lost her husband 10 years ago, and she swears her dog came back with hair like a wet shadow. People remember things if you ask them gently." Jack's face paled. "Nolan's men they'll watch for tampering." "So we don't tamper." Elena's hands were steady. "We act like neighbors. We ask the right questions. We stitch together what is already frayed." They began to move like thieves at dawn, quiet, purposeful. Elena taught Jack how to read the land in a different register. The hollow at a log meant not rot, but a sleeping place. The lichen patterns on a stone were letters if you knew the dialect. She taught him how to let his breath get small, to fold inside the trees like an apology. Jack taught her to hold a camera without flinching, to document the small things that make witness stubborn. A tuft of hair snagged on a branch, an arrangement of stones that seemed too deliberate to be the work of wind. In the evenings they compared notes over Anna's table, the wooden talisman between them like a mediator. They grew companionable with each other's silences, the way elbows can touch without speaking. The pointless things, the crooked teeth of a laugh, the way one of them stirred sugar too much, became small away from the world intimacies. Jack found he could tell Elena things he had not told himself. How often at night he had walked by his brother's room, put his palm on the bed as if heat could be pressed back into life. How he sometimes dreamed his brother called him from the trees in a voice like wind through a bottle. Elena's fingers would find his hand under the table when he said such things, not in pity but in shared steadiness. But intimacy grew against the pressures closing in like seasons. One afternoon, as they set out a motion sensor where Jack had first found the prints, a pickup lurched down the gravel, and a man in a blue uniform stepped toward them with a camera of his own. Broad, federal, a lens like a judgment. Nolan had expanded his net. He didn't need to ask questions. He had the gravity of power to do that for him. He merely looked at the setup and then at Jack, and for a moment the two men measured one another like balances. "You're interfering," Nolan said, voice folded in steel. "We're documenting," Jack said, the word tasteless now that the government shelf of document implied a chain of custody and regression to a report. "For the town." "For the town," Nolan repeated, as if testing whether the word could be used in a way that felt like a shield. "This is a federal operation now. We have to ensure safety." Elena stepped between them before either man realized she had moved. She kept her voice calm, the way a rock keeps the river from sweeping away the bank. "There are people here who remember things," she said. "You can't just shut that down and think it will be settled." Nolan's eyes flicked to her, to the talisman peeking from the inside of her pocket. "Ms. Maru, I've read the Mararu file. There are allowances for cultural practices, but we also have national security to consider. If you continue to interfere with a federal operation—" "You're calling their spirits interference?" Elena interrupted. She had an ache in her voice that made the lie between them clatter. "They're people in your file, Agent Thorne. There are children. There are families." Nolan's face softened for a breath. And in that softened moment there was a suggestion of something else, long buried. The single-man facade cracked, and the man inside looked like a man who had once chosen order over all else, and had perhaps lost something important to that calculus. "This isn't about people and not people," he said low. "It's about risk. It's about predictable outcomes. You can't predict a communion, Elena said quietly. You can't file it. The standoff lasted only a few minutes, but left them all closer and farther at once. People in the town watched, neighbors craning necks that had no right to know, but could not stop themselves from murmuring. Rumor became a live animal that breathed into windows and slid like cold water under doors. Some stood with Nolan. Some spoke to Anna in soft voices about stories that grandparents had told in secret. The line between law and lore blurred until it became something porous and dangerous. That night, after Nolan's truck pulled away and radios buzzed with the kind of order that sounds like locks being set, Jack walked the line of lights on the motel ceiling like a man counting the hours. He felt the weight of everything: his brother's absence, the talisman warm in his pocket, Elena's hand against him in memory, and knew the next steps would require more than stealth or charm. They would need to force a reckoning that the government would resist, and that meant choosing how much of himself he would trade for the truth. When he imagined the alternative, if Nolan built cages and called it science, his stomach clenched in a way he had not felt since the casket had been lowered. He imagined the creatures pressed into unknown rooms, their fingers folded like dead branches, their eyes used as data points. The thought made his skin prickle with cold fire. It wasn't just about his brother anymore. It was about whether the world would be allowed to keep its wildness, whether a country's hunger for control would be allowed to swallow something that had been keeping a balance longer than any department had existed.
This is where Act 2 tightened its knots. A town split, laws pressed against old rights, men in uniform who measured safety with clipboards, and two people, one raised by the land, the other by the ledger, trying to hold the world in a different shape. Their daily motions, setting cameras, speaking to grieving relatives, visiting the hollow they thought might be a shelter, became a form of resistance. Each small success, a neighbor's story corroborated, a camera catching movement that wasn't human, was a fragile, brilliant thread. Each failure, a sensor seized by federal tech, an elderly witness intimidated into silence, was a bruise. And always the forest breathed. It kept its counsel and let them take from it what it would, but it would not be owned. With each passing hour, Jack felt the pull of a decision forming like a bruise. To fight Nolan in a public way that might put them all at risk, or to protect the forest and the creatures by hiding what they found and living with a secret heavier than grief. Elena watched him pick at the edges of that decision like a person peeling at a scab. Sometimes he would look like a man ready to leap. Sometimes he looked like a man who might turn and run. One night, as rain fell and the town's lights made halos through the mist, Elena told him a story her grandmother had once told under a sky that had nothing to do with rational calendars. It was a story of a child who followed a trail of footprints into a grove and was welcomed, not taken, because the child had come not to take, but to learn. The child left changed. Jack listened and felt something in his chest unclench. He realized his ledger had never been about ledger at all. It had been about a need to be acknowledged, to be part of a world that had room for his brother in it. He realized with a slow, dawning terror and relief that the fight ahead was not merely against Nolan or a department's policy, but against the version of himself that wanted to fix and classify rather than listen and protect. Act 2 ended not with resolution, but with an escalation. Cameras planted and then discovered, a witness's courage sapped by a threat, an intimate conversation that turned toward a plan that could not be half done. They had stitched together a map of small truths and half-remembrances, but the next move would ask more than stealth. It would ask for a public to which the government and the forest both had claims. It would ask Jack whether he could become the kind of man who could carry a secret like a living thing and not let it die under him. And it would ask Nolan what he would do when the thing he had sworn to control proved that control required compassion, a word no one in a uniform had practiced for long. Outside, beyond the thin walls, the pines kept their vigil. Somewhere under their roots, something older than departments and disputes shifted, as if listening to the conversation of the town and deciding whether it should be answered at all.
They found the first fracture in the softest place, a photograph. It was tucked into a file Nolan had not expected Jack to see when he lifted a loose paper to read the scrawled margins. The picture was small, grainy, and raw with a light that had been wrong for the year it was labeled, autumn where it should have been summer. It showed a man with a beard no longer than a week's growth, standing beside a girl who could have been Elena's sister, both of them awkward with the shame of being photographed. Behind them, under a tarp, the outline of a crate that did not belong to any home, and a bulge of fur where something, small then, absurdly small, was folded into the world like a thing that could be kept. Jack's breath left him in a single sharp exhale that might have been a laugh if grief could become such a thing. That's... His voice broke when he said the name of the man it pictured. The ledger of the past rearranged itself with the force of betrayal. The man was in an old photograph Jack had been shown at a memorial, a volunteer who had helped organize a search. Here, in Nolan's neat handwriting, were dates and a note. Authorized transfer. Juvenile specimen. Controlled environment. A redacted name left a blank like a ripped-out page. Elena's face went pale in a way the forest had not taught her to be. The talisman at her throat swung like a pendulum. She reached for the photograph as if it might rearrange into something less damning. "My grandmother," she said. The words were small and puzzled. She had grown up with honest stories of the woods as a living thing, stories that kept the village's children from wandering at night. But she had never suspected a ledger where land met government, where a favor might have been paid with the costliest currency, the surrender of something living. Nolan watched them both, the curve of his mouth a careful geometry. "There are historical precedents," he said, voice low and apolitical. "Conservation programs, relocation attempts. Sometimes local leaders cooperate in the interest of safety. We have witnesses who corroborate transfers, rare but documented." Elena's fingers went white around the photograph. "My grandmother would never..." Her voice stopped because she understood, in the way children understand math, that adults sometimes barter with the sacred for something they called security. If she did, maybe she thought she was saving them. Jack felt a new kind of nausea then, a sickening vertigo of insight. What if those they had trusted, keepers of hearth and custom, had handed pieces of the forest to men like Nolan, thinking they were protecting their kin? What if his brother's trail had crossed one of those trades and been marked for erasure because he'd seen too much? "You said there were children," Jack said, looking at Nolan as if the agent's eyes could be pried open like a safe. Nolan's hand stilled on the folder, as if the paper were a live thing. For a fraction of a second, the agent's posture softened into something human and private. "We have records of juveniles in controlled facilities," he admitted, "but those records are complicated. Some entries correspond with non-human designations. Others were logged and then sealed for national interest." The words landed like slaps. Elena's breath left her in a sound like wind through bare twigs. "Non-human designations?" she echoed, voice ablaze. "You classified them so you could do what? Pretend they weren't kin? Pretend you were doing science and not theft?" "It wasn't theft," Nolan said, too quickly. "It was containment. We were trying to study behaviors, to understand risk. We were theoretically..." He stopped, because the theory had the smell of a cemetery where intentions went to be buried. Behind his calm, there was a seedier honesty. Men in offices had decided the forest's right to secrecy was a liability, and in the name of prevention, they had chosen control. "We could make policy. We could create protocols." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, the talisman biting into skin. "You made protocols around living things," she said, the phrase like acid. "You made cages out of law." In the motel's lopsided light, their alliance, delicate and newly woven, went taut. Jack looked from Nolan to Elena and felt the room spin in a way no forest had done. Betrayal had a sound. It clacked and hissed and smelled like paper. It was not only the government's betrayal of the wild, but the betrayal of trust between people who needed each other the way roots need soil. "What did you tell them?" Elena demanded of Anna when they went back to the Moraru house late, and Anna's face, carved by time and custom, bore the pale scratches of old decisions. Anna's eyes were patient wells. She did not defend herself so much as unspool a long, small regret. A smokehouse conversation where men with soft voices promised protection, a shortage of livestock, a winter that threatened her neighbors, a barter where she thought she would be buying safety. They asked for access, Anna said simply, as if bureaucratic language could translate the cost of something wild. They said they would keep it safe. I thought the children were safe. We thought we were making a choice with our hands tied. Anger and sorrow did not make alliances. That night they made fissures. Elena recoiled as if struck. You promised to protect them, she said. You promised the balance. I promised food, Anna countered, the thinness of reproach in her voice like paper against a stone. I thought... She stopped, because there are acts you cannot explain without sounding smaller than you wish to be. The house held an old ache. The talisman between them seemed suddenly heavy with a cost no one had paid the price of in full. Jack watched as Elena stepped away from the room, her steps small and uneven like someone who had been learning to walk on a different kind of ground.
The discovery that the people who had been the custodians of the old ways had also made bargains with the state cut a clean, merciless line through their budding trust. She had loved the idea of her family's purity, of their stubborn refusal to let the modern world catalog the magic. But love is complicated, and human decisions are porous. The realization that tradition had been compromised in hunger and fear made her eyes glass over with outrage and grief. You kept it from me, Elena said finally, the accusation not to Jack but to the past. She pressed her palms against the kitchen counter as if to anchor herself. Anna's hands folded like a plea. We protected what we could, child. We tried. The world is hungry. Jack felt his own hope rending in his chest. The Mararu house, which had felt like sanctuary, now felt like the place where secrets lived and were traded. Trust had become a ledger itself, full of red numbers. Then Nolan did something Jack had not expected. He offered a fragment of confession that fractured his own sternness. There were protocols I followed, he said one night in the sheriff's office when the town was asleep and the radios hummed like distant insects. I approved relocations. I signed documents. Sometimes it felt right at the time. He looked at Jack, and in that look was a man who had once answered a different, more private kind of grief with the same bureaucratic arm. We were scared. We were trying to prevent people from getting hurt. But the longer you study something, the less of it is yours. The admission did not redeem him. It did not erase the crate's outline in the photograph, but it split Nolan into two silhouettes, the agent who wrote policies and the man who could, perhaps, be ashamed. For a heartbeat, Jack imagined Nolan unsheathing regret like a bad habit. The image was small and dangerous, an enemy who could be soft. What followed was a flight of shards, witnesses recanting at federal pressure, Anna falling silent at unexpected threats to her land, Jack and Elena arguing with a fierceness that made them strangers, her accusation that he had been naive about institutional appetite, his accusation that he had hidden the compromise of her ancestry. Love, until then a slow, warm current between them, buckled under the weight of secrets. The things that bound them, shared bewilderment, the tenderness of midnight bread, a history of watching the pines, felt fragile where memory had been co-opted by survival. You didn't tell me, Elena said, the hurt raw enough to be physical. You went into the forest and you thought you could make it clean. You thought you could fix things by proving them. You didn't trust that we could live with the stories. Jack's voice was a raw thing. I thought proof would save him. I thought if I could show people what had happened, maybe someone would have to answer. He pressed his palms to his face as if he could smother the embarrassment of hope.
I wanted him back. You thought cages were answers, she said. You thought men with folders should get to decide. Between them, the morrow felt dangerous. Their project, watching, listening, collecting, was now a liability, not only to the forest, but to the fragile, tender thing growing between them. Nolan's surveillance tightened like a net. Anna's confession had torn a seam through community trust. The town, hungry for certainty, pressed its face against the window of rumor. And yet the deepest fracture was less public and more private. the one inside Jack, where the ledger he had lived by faltered into a rubble of questions. He had come to the forest to prove a single sentence true, that his brother had not vanished into nothing, but had encountered something old and possibly kind. Instead, he had found evidence that men had decided to write over nature's voice with their own ink. The knowledge slid into him like cold and made him feel small. As Jack left Anna's house into a night so thick the stars had been swallowed, he felt Elena's last words follow him. "Don't make them into an exhibit, Jack. If you love them, you protect them." The sentence stuck to the inside of his skull like a thorn. He wanted to believe Nolan's confession was the pivot that could swing them back, an admission that might become a plea for repair. But admissions are fragile when they come from the mouths of men who built careers on containment. The fracture was not easily mended. It ran like a river through the town, through the family, through the relationship between the man who wanted proof and the woman who wanted protection. In the motel room, Jack turned the talisman over in his hand and felt both the weight of betrayal and the thin warmth of Elena's small rituals. The forest hummed beyond the thin walls, patient and terrible. If secrets had been traded for cans of soup and promises of safety, the creatures might already be in boxes somewhere, their hands folded like small confessions. If that were true, then the act of reclaiming them would demand something more than photographs and petitions. It would demand reckoning, and reckoning would not leave anyone whole. Outside, a distant howl pushed through the trees. It was less animal than a question asked aloud. Jack held the sound in his chest and felt the snap of decision form like a bruise that had finally to be touched. The fractures were many and painful. The choices ahead would carve them all into different shapes. Jack's decision hardened like something set in bone. He could feel it as a pressure in his ribs, a promise forming with the single clearness of a pledge. They would not let men in suits box the forest the way people boxed specimens in jars. If Nolan would not undo what his office had authorized, then someone would have to break open the file with force. They moved at dawn, the woods a cathedral of breath and drip.
Elena led. They walked the old paths her grandmother had taught her, not for cunning, but for rightness, her hands moving as if speaking to the land. Anna's talisman hung at Jack's throat now, warmed by the skin where it lay. The plan was small and desperate. Lure the federal crew away from the grove, get eyes on the crates, and, if there were any living things inside, bring them to a place where the forest could hide them again. Nolan came too, which surprised Jack with the force of a weather shift. He had spent a night staring at his folder as if it were a heart beating under paper, and finally decided, in the quiet calculus of men who had seen the ledger tilt too far toward policy and not enough toward mercy, that containment without conscience was cruelty. "I can get you a window," he said simply. There was no self-congratulation in it, just a man choosing to stand in the breach between what had been done and what could be made right. The federal perimeter was tidy and false, sarin wrap of orange mesh, trucks like sleeping beetles, tech humming with its own authority. Jack's throat closed at the sight of it. The grove felt smaller with men and geometry imposed upon it. They skirted patrols with Elena's knowledge and Jack's clumsy nerve. When they reached the crate-lined clearing, the smell of damp fur and pines stung like betrayal. The crates were not empty. There were small sounds inside, breath that was more than animal, small adjustments that felt like frightened decisions. They worked fast. Elena whispered an old language under her breath, a pattern of syllables taught in kitchens and doorways, a song meant to remind the forest's kin that they had hands that could be trusted. Jack pried at a latch with a pocket knife, his hands shaking with the knowledge that the future might be a bruise if he made a wrong motion. Nolan watched the tree line, jaw set like a hinge, radio clenched in his fist. He had used his credentials to reroute a shift, to send the bulk of his team on a wild goose chase to the far side of a ridge, an act that would cost him more than a bad report. The first crate opened with a soft, desperate sound, like someone exhaling after a long drowning. A juvenile pressed its face to the gap, eyes like dusk, hands that curled around air with the awkward solemnity of a child finding its fingers. Elena dropped to her knees without thinking, palms wide, and the creature answered by pressing its small palm to hers through the crate's bars. Jack's breath left him in a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. It was his ledger closing and opening at once. But the world is rarely tidy. Radios crackled across the ridge. A patrol had returned early, suspicious of Nolan's diversion. Men in heads-down haste spill like ants into the clearing. The federal orders snapped into something sharp. Hold positions, contain and report.
Nolan straightened and stepped into that circle between men in uniform and the crate where a small life clung to Elena's hand like a prayer. "You'll finish what you've started,"
One of the agents barked orders that were practice rather than conviction. They had been schooled to believe in paper before persons. Nolan didn't answer with policy. He answered with a physical decision. He moved between the agent and Elena and the juvenile, putting his own body into the measuring line as if he could weigh law against the weight of a living thing and choose the living. "I'm standing down this operation," he said. The words were dangerous. They sounded like a man revoking an oath in full view of his peers. "This is not containment. This is theft. I will accept the consequences." It was a confession and a challenge all at once. The agent's features folded into statutory surprise. Steps were taken toward Nolan with hands that had once ordered arrests. Jack saw the calculus in Nolan's face, and for the first time since the station, recognized the man behind the badge, not a machine, but someone who had chosen mercy as liability. He moved to help Elena lift the crate open wider and felt the scrape of metal like a removed seam. The juveniles tumbled into the soft hush of the forest, as if they'd been released from a dream that had been too long. And then shots rang like the cracking of old ice. Not at the creatures. No one aimed that cruelty, but into the air. The agent at Nolan's back had his hands trembling. Someone had decided escalation would be a show of control. A bullet kicked up dirt and struck Nolan, a bloom of plum on his shoulder that made him hiss, and for a wild, terrible second, the world narrowed to the smell of blood and pine. Nolan did not cry out for himself. He reached instead for the radio, voice steady with an authority that had been trained into him, but now worn in service of something else. "Pull back," he ordered the men who were not his to command. "Containment is suspended. No further action." The sentence held because men listened to the steady bark of a man who won't be moved from his line. They hesitated, confusion and the first thin threads of conscience making the air porous. Elena gathered the juveniles in a blanket the town had used for harvests, cradling them like a woman who had learned long ago how to keep what came to her safe. Jack felt the world lift and tilt at once. The creatures were not caged anymore, and Nolan, wounded and wrong and fiercely upright, had made the sacrifice by becoming the single man between their mercy and a department's paperwork. They moved the juveniles deeper into the trees where the understory protected them, moss-bedded hollows, roots that curled like arms, a place the federal trucks could not see from the gravel road. Anna had come with them, a small figure with a shawl that smelled of broth and coal.
She murmured as she walked, a soft litany of apology and benediction, as if asking the forest's forgiveness for its people's bargains. Elena pressed her forehead to Anna's in a gesture so private it could have been a benediction for a corpse. Forgiveness bought and sold, now sought with bare hands. When the last juvenile melted into the shadow of the pines, a hush came down like rain. The creatures waited at the edge of the clearing, not with the hunger of predators, but with the dignity of kin reclaiming kin. Several of them stood tall, their forms breaking the line of trunks like strange statues finding motion. They did not attack. They did not consent to be catalogued. They watched, mournful and measured, and it felt as if centuries of patient watching were being returned as glances. One of the larger figures, taller than a man, shoulders that seemed shaped by wind, stepped forward and placed a hand on Nolan's shoulder. The contact was not violent. It was not triumphal. It was the touch of something recognizing its name on a man's skin. Nolan's breath hitched, and his face, bruised by sun and by guilt, and by the new warmth of mercy, went soft. He sagged as if the weight of having chosen had finally been acknowledged. Jack, standing beside Elena, felt everything rearrange. The forest had not needed them to prove anything. It had only needed someone to decide which ledger to keep. He had chosen. Nolan had chosen. Elena had chosen. They had given a different kind of proof, not photographs boxed in files, but action that could not be reduced to data. When the agents finally retreated, back to trucks, back to the neat boxes of their training, Nolan lay back on a bed of moss and let the forest hold him. He would be called in for investigations. He would be censured, perhaps jailed, perhaps lauded in secret. He had burned his career to light a small room for something that had not asked for light. Jack sat with his hand on a juvenile's head, small and breathing, like a thing that had been forgiven. Elena's fingers found his, warm and sure. Their eyes met across the small animal and the wounded man and the trunks that held this new, trembling covenant. There was no grand promise, just a tight, fierce tether. We protect what must remain, and we love in a way that chooses the whole over the ledger. Nolan, when Jack turned his head, gestured with a half-smile that was not unlike a blessing. "You did the right thing," he said, voice a rasp under the pine-scented air. The admission was thin but true. Jack thought of his brother, disappeared into the particular mercy of a forest that did not want to be owned. He could not bring him back with headlines, but he could at last honor the thing his brother may have found, a life that refused to be contained. Elena leaned against Jack, the contact small but seismic. "We keep them hidden," she murmured, voice a vow. "We teach them the songs again. We make roads that never remember." Jack nodded. He had wanted to prove. Instead, he'd learned to protect. In the hush made by relieved breath and the soft padding of creatures melting into root and shadow, their hands tightened. Nolan's sacrifice had cracked open a future none of them could have filed neatly, and for once, that was enough. Above them, the pines whispered, and the forest held its peace like a secret accepted back into the body of the world. They buried Nolan's wound with the town's hands, a hurried stitch, a hospital room with 2 bright lights, and then a quiet letting go of the career he'd signed away. There were inquiries that smelled of paper and regret. There were men who called him reckless, and men who called him brave. He took it all like a man who had finally paid a debt he had accrued in years of small, righteous compromises. There were consequences, formal reprimands, a slow cooling from colleagues who preferred tidy margins over messy mercy. But he kept the look of someone who had chosen the living over the ledger, and that look steadied him more than any medal could. Anna's confession rippled outward, and, painfully, some neighbors turned their backs. Yet others came forward, old stories released like breath, people who had been ashamed, people who had bartered in desperation, people who wanted to make amends. The town changed not because it was forced, but because it had to. Rituals returned to kitchens, songs were taught again where they could be taught safely, and a committee, homemade and careful, formed to guard the patch of forest that had always been more sacred than property. They learned to sit in silence on the edges and let the trees speak first. Jack did not find his brother in the way he'd once imagined, no sudden, cinematic reunion. What he found over weeks and years was a quieter return of meaning. Stories surfaced, an old trail, a jacket left snagged on a branch, a whistle heard in autumn when the leaves turned like coins. He could not be certain any of them were the brother who had gone whistling into the pines, but certainty gave way to something truer, the knowledge that the forest remembered him, and that memory was being guarded. Elena taught the children of the town the old listening, how to hear the small grammar of lichen, the punctuation of twig breaks. She and Jack built a life that was not free of grief, but fashioned around it. Nights of soup and guarded maps, days of gentle patrol, and afternoons when they would sit at the edge of the grove and let the world move between them. Their love, tempered by fractures and forgiveness, grew like the understory, slow, patient, dense with green things that sheltered the seedling below. The juveniles grew under their watch in places the federal trucks could not find, hollows stitched with moss, a ruined barn whose roof had been taken by weather long ago, the hidden map Anna had kept folded in her mattress. They learned human songs alongside forest calls, and when they moved between trunks and town, they did so with a steadiness that surprised everyone who had expected monsters. The town learned, too, to respect boundaries, to keep their curiosity from turning to cages. On the first anniversary of the raid that became a rescue, Jack stood where he'd first found the oversized print and pressed his palm to the earth. Elena's fingers found his, and Anna's shawl brushed his shoulder. Nolan, scarred and softer, stood a little apart, watching, as if he were seeing a world he had once tried to measure and had now learned only to witness. A single footprint, fresh and clear, crossed the clearing, the shape too large to be measured by boots, but not so vast as to be unknowable. Jack smiled then, a small, bruised thing that held an answer he had been craving for years. He lifted his face to the trees, and without thinking, he whistled the note his brother used to hum, bright, imperfect, an offering rather than a command. From the shadowed understory came an answering breath, soft, long, and not of men. The sound was not a reunion so much as an agreement. The forest would keep its own, and those who love it would keep their promises in turn. They stood together in the hush, and the pines leaned in as if to listen.